So it seems that the strangers are becoming friends. So this is even more enjoyable when the strangers become friends. This is good, which reminds me that strangers should call me David.
Thank you, David.
Okay, so in formalities over. Too many agendas this afternoon. Many people have spoken to me since this morning, and so will I say anything about literature? Will I say anything about political situations? Will I say anything about theology? Will I say anything about that? So you obviously have many ideas about what we should talk about, and I'm quite happy to talk where I have anything to say, and I will stop if I have no competence or knowledge. And of course, history questions are also really important. I didn't talk to our historian from history. Yeah, I didn't talk to history people, but I think there are some really important history questions that we should ask as well. But there is not time for everything. I said I would say some things about yeah, surveillance ethics, privacy, human rights, resistance. I began talking about those things this morning in response to questions and partly coming out of my talk anyway. I'm very deeply concerned about the need for surveillance ethics. And certainly I learned from Bauman that if we are going to exercise human agency appropriately in the world, then it has to be a moral commitment to do so. And Ligmund is always talking about the ethical questions and wanting to grapple with the ethical tensions of the liquid present. The surveillance ethics that we need has to do with today's digital realities, but it also has to connect with the ethics and the approaches from other historical eras. We happen to live in digital times now, but there's much to learn. Again, I said this morning, from earlier forms of literature, from historical precedents. There are so many ways in which an ethic can be developed. And if there was such an ethical approach, or if there were such ethical approaches, then to what extent can they help us inform our efforts to push back against forms of surveillance that we together believe are unnecessary, unwarranted, unwelcome, unjust, illegal, and so on. So can such an ethic, or the development of such an ethics, help us to push back, us as academics in what we can do as academics, us as members of a larger political community working with others who are not necessarily academics. I told you the kind of definition of surveillance that I work with, but it has to do with focused attention to personal details for the purposes of management or protection or entitlement, whatever. And that is the definition that I work with, and I still think that it's a good way of thinking about surveillance. It can be questioned in many ways, but it's still a definition that is useful for many purposes, and that's all definitions do. They're useful for helping us to understand situations. Already there is a difficulty with the very idea of paying focused attention to personal details, because now it's not just personal details in the sense of biometrics like my facial image or my fingerprint or my DNA or something like that, or words that I say or actions that I perform. It's also encompassed in what I was saying in response to Adeline's question about Deleuze and individuals and individuals. It's metadata, so it's beyond just the things that we might associate with the person, like iris scans or a criminal record or an educational record. It's not just those things, it's now metadata as well, which makes personal details even more difficult to piece together. And moreover, it's not only our activities, it's our activities mediated through our devices and the systems that we work with. So the phone that I am connected to, the smartphone, cell phone, whatever, is the device which is, strictly speaking, under surveillance. But because it's connected with me, the surveillance of the device is surveillance of me, so that becomes part of my personal details, okay? So, likewise, the MacBook that I use for my personal computer, my laptop, is the thing which is under surveillance, because my internet protocol, my IP address, is the thing that connects with me, but the surveillance is of the device, really. But it's because of my association with the device that personal data is connected with me. So it's not just emanating from my person, my actions, my words, my irises, my whatever. It's what the device is recording that relates to me. And just while I'm thinking about it, the historical note there is really important, I think, because the devices that we use that give off information about us are not only computer devices, they're not only digital devices. The work of somebody called Josh Lauer at University of New Hampshire has shown how machines from the 19th century and early 20th century also were important places where the idea of evidence-producing machines began. So we often think, oh yes, this is the computer era, therefore everything to do with surveillance is mediated through computer. Sure, it's the primary means of mediation today, but the idea that you have an object that Rob Kitchen says has become a log-ject, play on English words, always complicated in a second language, but you think you'll see that object becomes log-ject. So it records the use of itself. So a hammer is an object, not a log-ject, because you can't tell from the hammer. The hammer doesn't produce any information about how it is used and when it is used or who used it. But the cell phone is a log-ject because it records its own use. The times, the persons using it, the places, GPS, etc., etc. It's all available in the device that records its own use. But in the 19th century, you had the invention of the camera. You had typewriters, end of the 19th, early 20th century. You had the telegraph. You had the telephone. And then you had moving pictures. So the recording of movement on film, etc. So the history is really important for us to see how the evidence-producing technologies don't start with computer technologies, they start way back. So we can see how historically there's been a development from those that, as with many technologies, is picked up in the new technologies. And of course we frequently define the new technologies in terms of the old technologies, because the old technologies are all we knew until the new ones came. And so it's very important for how we appropriate and assess and evaluate the new technologies, what technologies operated go forward. So we have to recognize the historical lineage of evidence-producing technologies. So that definition, focused attention to personal details for the purposes of management or whatever, is already complicated when I bring in the history and the history of technology, and when I point out that it's not just me, it's my device, or the device that is associated with me that is actually under surveillance. I still think the definition works, but I've just complicated it for you to show you that it's not straightforward at all. And of course the reminder that the surveillance is always for a purpose is crucial, because we have to look at the reason for which this is being deployed. And it has to be purposeful, it has to be deliberate, intentional, because we have to distinguish between the glance, the inconsequential look, and the gaze, which is always purposeful, intentional, and has certain purposes built into it. The point of the gaze has to be worked out. The glance is a different kind of study, and of course it's not neutral or inconsequential either, but it's different from the gaze that we're thinking about in surveillance. So, and no, I'm not going to talk about Lacan, but I'll tell you a story. Okay, so I'll introduce somebody to you called Faisal Gill. Now, Faisal Gill is a member of the Republican Party in the United States of America. And because he is an upstanding member of the American establishment, he believes that he should raise his children in a particular way. And so he sent them to a Catholic school so that they would receive the kind of moral training that he believed was appropriate. He rose through the ranks. He's a lawyer, and he also has technical capacities. He rose through the ranks and had quite high-level security clearance within the American system. And it just, in every way, a kind of exemplary, patriotic American citizen. And he discovered last year that he was under systematic surveillance by the NSA. The reason? Well, Faisal Gill is a Muslim. And he might be a Republican Party member. He might have high levels of security clearance himself. He might send his kids to a Catholic school, be an upstanding member of his community, do voluntary work in the neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. But he is under NSA surveillance for special scrutiny, as they call it. And, you know, the FBI and the NSA and these other agencies have been taught that serious Muslims are dangerous, that they are, according to the handbook, prone to violence. So he's under special scrutiny. Now, when he discovered, through what Snowden revealed, that he had been under surveillance, he found it very shocking, not surprisingly, because he believed, and it's clear from his life, that he was what he said he was. And even if, you know, I wouldn't ever join the Republican Party, I doubt if I'd send my kids to Catholic school, etc. But he believed that he was doing certain things, and I'm sure that if I met him, I would enjoy his company and be able to talk with him about, you know, certain kinds of things. But he was under special scrutiny, and for all I know, he still is. He now knows that that's all. So, Faisal Gil, after the McCarthyism of the 1950s and 60s, something called FISA was invented, the Foreign Intelligence Services Act, and it was supposed to limit the excesses of McCarthyism. It was supposed to get over McCarthyism, and it was supposed to turn surveillance into a much more targeted matter that did not involve people who should not have been under scrutiny. What happened to FISA? Well, you could well ask what happened to it. So there's the story. Faisal Gil. Whatever you think of, you know, however you would feel about meeting someone like him, the fact is that to his consternation, he was under special scrutiny by the NSA, regarded as a dangerous person, despite the record that I have rehearsed for you. So in many ways, his story is one that A, shows what the NSA has been doing, but it also shows how surveillance is unevenly distributed depending on what group we find ourselves in. That categorical suspicion, that is to say, the suspicion that rests upon you because you happen to fall within a certain demographic category, is something that is crucial to what I think of as the social sorting capacities of contemporary surveillance. And of course, that those social sorting capacities are exactly what are enhanced by the use of digital technologies. Because if computing technologies do anything, it is to classify and subclassify in very complex ways. And so the idea that you can make such categories becomes far more feasible using computer technologies. And that which has been done for a very long time is now facilitated with the use of the digital. Again, the historical things like consumer surveillance, which again, many people think, oh, that's what Amazon does because they seem to know us really well, and they seem to know what books we want to read and what movies we want to see. Oh, well, no, Netflix knows what movies you want to see. These companies, they know as well. This is all the product of computing. Well, nonsense. Our historian friends will tell us in the United States of America in the 1920s, there were extensive forms of consumer surveillance at that time using large ledgers. Okay, so big volumes in which details about consumers were written down and classified according to the value of the consumer to the corporation. So it started with the department stores, and they would record in great detail who were the most valuable customers. how often they bought things, how much they spent, where they lived, who they were associated with. So it's not just digital, it's been going on for a long time in the consumer realm. And so that kind of classification, another kind of social sorting according to economic value of the individual to the corporation. Nice to know that we're classified in this way, isn't it? That sort of thing has been going on for a long time, but it's hugely facilitated by computing technologies. So that social sorting that divides us into categories according to similar traits that we have to others who are in the same group as us is the way that our record is made up, the profile, the individual that has connections with us, but if we were given this, we might not recognize it as being who I think I am, but that's the way that the system operates. Yeah, so that social sorting process is what produces highly uneven forms of surveillance that divide us according to criteria that frequently are not available to us and not transparent to us in any way. It's also the reason why when government departments say, or when the popular media says, well, if you have done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. This is a pernicious lie that could not be more untrue. Because although in the kind of world that we might all like to live in, where it is true that if you have done nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear, that would be a good thing, I think. Who would mind living in that kind of a world where if you have lived in a way that is appropriate, that you have nothing to fear? I mean, it's a good thing to hope for, but not a good thing to believe in an era of mass surveillance, because it is not you. It is the creation, the made-up you, the made-up me, that is the crucial thing. And increasingly we are made up by the group with which we are associated by the systems. So you can live an exemplary life, but still be suspect, still be under special scrutiny, just because you fall into that category: demographic, consumer, economic, country of background, whatever it is. That background is what defines you for the point, from the point of view of the system that is attempting to do the surveillance. So the reasons why those kinds of phrases about nothing to hide, nothing to fear is so wrong is because of the way that surveillance is done. So for Faisal Gill, the Muslim who found himself under special scrutiny, this shows us not only the ways in which the NSA operates a promiscuous form of mass surveillance, but also how uneven the surveillance is depending on what category you fall in. Which is why I think the social sorting question is so important, and why, if you talk about privacy, it cannot but be connected with social justice, because it has to do with that uneven distribution of surveillance. For Faisal Gill too, of course, whatever they are doing to democracy, Republicans still claim to believe in democracy, and democracy is a state in which the people are allowed to know, in fact are expected to know, what their government is doing. Faisal Gill had no idea what his government was doing to him. It also gives democracy also gives the opportunity for those who are the people to question the government for what it is doing. If you don't know what the government is doing, and if, when you question the government, you are regarded as suspect, then something has gone very wrong with some certain classical understandings of democracy. So I said this morning that unlike well, the first book that I wrote exclusively about surveillance is The Electronic Eye. And I was talking to someone a few minutes ago who said that they read this book from 1994. Oh no, it is in Spanish, that's right. In that book I was quite stringent in my critique of privacy. And over the 21 years since that book came out, I've changed my views and I am more receptive to using privacy because the things that I complained about in 1994 have been changing. And because many people who are using the term privacy today are not using it with that classic liberal, abstract, individualistic or property-related understanding of privacy. Today it is much more used in a context where it is empowering, connected with human rights and responsibilities, and related to democracy and political action as a means to that end. So because so many more people are using it in that way, I cheerfully say in the new book about Snowden that my views about this thing have changed. So you can argue with me if you like. Maybe you think that I betrayed the cause. Maybe you think that I should have stuck with my opposition to privacy. But I also think that the issues have become so important after Snowden that we cannot ignore them anymore. And if there is an opposition that is mobilized around a concept, even if I disagree with many uses of that concept, if opposition to it is mobilized using the concept of privacy, then I will hold my nose and use the concept of privacy, even though once I really didn't like it. So, you know, that's the reason why I now changed my mind, but we can discuss how far that can go. I think that for exposing what's wrong with mass surveillance and for underpinning of other kinds of freedoms, that privacy can still work. I think of it as being also associated with freedom of expression, association, religion, conscience, and movement. All those things that I think are worth pursuing can be assisted by using the concept of privacy in the context of anti-surveillance or anti-mass surveillance activities. The idea of privacy as a right has been enshrined in, for example, UN constitutions from the declarations from the beginning, from 1948, and stated quite recently, 2014, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights came back to the idea of privacy as being a right within the declaration. Which, again, in light of what I was saying earlier, does not necessarily make things easier. The fact that we can see it as a right is only a starting point. It doesn't take us right into the questions. So, for example, at the time of the UN Declaration in the 1940s, it was much easier to distinguish between privacy as a right that related to who I communicate with or how I communicate, privacy as having to do with territory. So that is to say, for example, I should be able to feel more private within my home than out in the street or wherever. might be associated with bodily privacy. You know, under what circumstances your body as a complete thing, or even parts of your body, would be private or not private. All those kinds of questions are much more difficult to, the distinctions are much more difficult to maintain when the different areas are collapsed digitally, when they kind of fall into a rather indistinct area. So today, it's that combination. I was saying it this morning, the example I gave when I was saying that you don't have to be on Facebook yourself to be on Facebook and to be on surveillance on Facebook. You don't have to have an account yourself. You're still vulnerable. And your facial image is connected with a name. The name may well be connected with several other things, possibly a telephone number, possibly an IP address. It certainly will be connected with other persons or organizations, corporations or whatever that you are associated with because you have bought from them or interacted with them or have an account with them or whatever. So the collapse of the image, the words, the body, the territory, I mean that too. Foursquare, and so many so-called location-based services are operate on where our machine is, where our device is at that time. So place, territory, space, body, image, words, so many things are now collapsed into one context that we have to go beyond how privacy was being understood at the time of the Declaration. But anyway, I still think that it's worth thinking about it as a right, even though we have to reinterpret it and rethink it for the present. And I should say, before we go any further, that I'm also aware that privacy, like any concept that we use, is always vulnerable to misappropriation, misconstrual, devious redefinition, political manipulation. Any concept that we use, however we might say, oh yeah, we want democracy. Democracy can so easily be subverted. We want to stand for human rights. Human rights, they can easily be a blind for selfish aspiration. I mean, anything, any concept that we use can be subverted, misused, abused, used inappropriately. So we always have to work on rework the definitions, review what we mean when we use this term. So I'm not using privacy as if somehow it's the thing that we can use to combat mass surveillance. I'm saying it's always debatable, always contestable. Bill Connolly, contested concepts. All these things are contestable and should be contested, including privacy. So I'm not making any special claim for privacy. It's the same as any other concept that we use. They're all contestable. And even when I was saying I may feel more private in my home than in the public street, immediately I was thinking, yeah, well, of course, there's just a key area where what is supposedly private in the home ought to be exposed in public because it involves, I don't know, domestic violence or something, that you use the privacy as a means of hiding that which should be out in the public. So even in what I was saying a moment ago, I could hear myself having to qualify the term, which is what we need to do all the time. Okay. Yeah, so many things have become important about surveillance, especially since the 1980s. augmented, as I say, by the digital, but we also have to notice the ways in which information has become a very important concept culturally, technologically, economically, and so on and so forth. In some ways, I think, in terms of political economy, information has become one of Polanyi's, what did he call those things? Fictitious commodities. Okay, it's become a fictitious commodity. How come information is a commodity at all? I think it's connected with Polanyi's understanding of fictitious commodities. Labor. How come labor is a commodity? Etc. So I think it's worth thinking about information. Also worth thinking about what we understand by information. This is a concept that we use the whole time. But how many of us have really thought about the meaning of information? You know, once it was what I learned from my grandmother. That was good information. It was a recipe for something I was cooking. It's good information. It was some farmer's almanac that told me what the weather was going to be like next week. That was good information too. You know, information used to be something that we gleaned from other people or from ancient wisdom or from, you know, just facts about how things worked. You know, when will the next train arrive at the station? It's a useful piece of information. So all those things are the way we used to think of information. But increasingly, as you who read M. Catherine Hale's work will know, information by the later, well, mid to late 20th century was losing its body. Information lost its connection with embodied human beings. And that was a critical point in the development of information as we understand it today. And because of that distinction, there was a British school and an American school who were arguing about what information really is in the 1950s. And the British school stood out firmly and said, information has always got to be connected with some kind of meaning. And the American school said, if you can count it and if you can make money from it, it's information. The American school won the debate. The British school lost, but the British school, in my view, were right. But that division of what happened in the Macy conferences in the 1950s, again, academics working together, trying to work out what's the way of defining something important, it was crucial for what was to happen later. Those Macy conferences were absolutely crucial for what was to happen. If you don't know M. Catherine Hale's work, it's in her book called How We Became Post-Human. The description, how we became post-human. M. Catherine Hales, Hayles. She's a wonderful kind of historian and sociologist of science and technology. And her husband is the craziest collector of ancient machines you could ever meet. Anyway, that's another story. So M. Catherine Hales. Yeah, M. Catherine Hales is the woman I was meaning. She talks about information losing its body. And it's a sort of feminist account of how women's labor in creating information in the 1950s, 60s became lost from the picture. And especially that women's labor in the production of information was pushed out. But today, that distinction is crucial in the very debates we're having over Snowden. Because as soon as the Snowden revelations came out, and people were saying, you mean our data is being scrutinized by the NSA? The governments pulled back and they said, oh no, nothing to worry about. It's okay, it's only metadata. There is no, meaning in this. It's just little concatenations of fragments of data. In other words, it was within that American school understanding of information. It doesn't connect with meaning, it's just bits. They're quantifiable, they're commodifiable, but they don't mean anything. Don't worry. That division is crucial for understanding what happened. And it was the 1950s when the debates were being held over what is information. So information is a concept that we really need to unpack as well if we're going to understand what's going on in this world. Risk, also, you're all aware of debates over the so-called risk society. Risk is another crucial concept for understanding the whole world of surveillance, because in order to assess and to cope with risk, you need this thing called information. And so risk, and the more risk becomes politically important as a feature of how we organize society, so more and more information is needed to assess the levels of risk and so on. So the emphasis on risk produces an appetite for information. We need information in order to assess risk. Also, the risk discourses help to direct forms of surveillance, especially after 9/11 in the security-obsessed world that we now live in. Risk in the sense that it was being used first in the 1960s was risk to the environment, risk to the natural environment through pollution, degradation of the environment, the using up of non-renewable resources, and so on and so forth. Those were the risks that warranted political attention when risk was first used. And in that case, the argument was, among those early climate change thinkers, they were saying, it appears to us that things are going very rapidly into a worse situation, out of which it will be more and more difficult to extract ourselves. And although we don't have all the science yet, we don't have all the empirical evidence that we need, we believe we should act now. Okay, so this is your Rachel Carson and those kinds of people back in the 60s making this kind of claim, and you remember it. It's part of our history. So risk to the environment. Once we know certain things, then we should take action, even though we don't have all the evidence yet, because the apparent consequences are too awful to contemplate. Okay, natural environment. Risk increasingly started to be used in human-oriented situations, not just environmental. But the same arguments were carried over as if you could apply to human beings that which was being applied to the natural environment. So think about how the argument goes. We don't yet have all the facts in. We don't have all the evidence that we need, but we should act now, even though we don't, because the consequences could be terrible. So we now use that in a post-9/11 situation for acting before we have evidence that this person really is a terrorist. Yeah, I think I made the point. You see the point. You can apply things in one area that you can see why it's worthwhile and appropriate to apply it in that area. But as soon as you start saying, well, we don't really have the evidence that this person is a terrorist, but you know what, terrorism can have such awful consequences that really we should treat them as a terrorist now, apprehend them, detain them, send them off to rendition to some other country, where we can just torture them for a while and see whether they... Anyway, So, definition of information, risk discourses, all these things are crucially important for understanding the way that surveillance has developed in the 21st century. And that's why we need to have some, I think, mobilizing concepts that are at least reminders about what might be an appropriate way forward that is used as an ethical springboard, starting point for counteracting those kinds of discourses and counteracting the mass surveillance that results from them. I have some notes in front of me, but I must confess that I'm making it up as I go along. I think I'll not use the notes because we can always stop and you can discuss things for a while and then we can get going again. I don't care how we do things. It's supposed to be a seminar, so if we reached a point that it would be good to ask some questions and have some discussion, then
yes, like having like a small session to discuss what he already present and then continue. Okay, Vivian.
Gracias, David, por estar con nosotros. Voy a hablar en español porque si en español hablo rápido, en inglés no se me entiende. Entonces, ella traduce generosamente. Nada, son dos asuntos a los que quiero apuntar, porque no voy a tocar el término de la privacidad, lo que he discutido, porque todavía me parece muy dudoso, no voy a meterme en eso en este momento. Pero ya yo he entendido que hay que partir de ese trabajo de Deleuze, de la sociedad de control, para poder entender la condición actual de la vigilancia que ustedes también trabajan, ¿no? Y que indican en el mismo libro de la conversación con Bauman que ya estamos en una condición post-panóptica, lo cual hace referencia a que ya el panóptico Foucaultiano no se aplica. Pero a mí lo que me interesa no es esa premisa de la que yo también estoy de acuerdo, sino que lo que me interesa es cuando Bauman entiende, yo creo que es usted el que se lo trae a colación, que el término ban optical sería estupendo para describir. Ahí, claro, inmediatamente ustedes tienen que reconocer que ese término, que no recuerdo ahora cuál es el autor, que lo tengo que buscar por mí, me parece que es italiano. Bueno, no lo recuerdo. Lo importante es que ahí ustedes reconocen que ese es un concepto que viene de el bando, de poner el bando de Agamben, y que obviamente eso también tiene que ver con el estado de excepción. O sea, el bando y el estado de excepción van un poco de la mano, pero que eso también todo en Agamben tiene que ver con la ley y con la soberanía, que la extiende hasta la biopolítica, cosa que para corregir a Foucault. Pero aquí el problema es, si yo he entendido bien, el bando sería lo que usted nos acaba de describir, el band optical, sería esa manera de distribuir la vigilancia según los grupos. Pero por otro lado, a mí no me queda claro, y es lo que quisiera apuntar, si la vigilancia podría ser un nuevo dominio del estado de excepción, pero que ya no tuviera que ver exactamente con lo legal, que también tiene que ver con lo ilegal, y no solamente en referencia al Estado, sino a la corporación y a la vida privada y a todo eso. O sea que lo que quisiera es si usted pudiera aclarar esa relación del ban optical con la distribución de la vigilancia a Agamben y el estado de excepción. Y además me gustaría que nos diera referencia de Agamben a la que se refirió esta mañana como una gran conferencia, etc. Para leerla. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, sure. I'll forget it if you don't. Okay, so Ben and DJ Vigo. DJ Vigo is who writes about the ban opticon. Okay. Okay, so I discussed some things with Zygmunt Bauman about the panopticon, because Bauman's work often uses that Foucault idea of the pivot, of the modernity and forms of discipline in modernity changing with the invention of the panopticon. So Bauman questions the idea that Foucault raised, or rather he's respectful of Foucault, of course, but he also thinks that Foucault underestimates the role of agency and so on when it comes to things like the panopticon. So Bauman thinks that the panoptic is no longer applicable. He thinks of a post-panoptic situation, and he has a number of different arguments that, that relate to that and relate to surveillance. Now, one thing that I don't think I have succeeded in trying to argue with Zygmunt Bauman is the extent to which two things happen. One, that the panopticon of Bentham that was written about by Foucault was actually a sorting machine as well as a watching machine. So the social sorting was already present in the panopticon. It is a sorting device. It sorts into different categories of criminality in the prison. So rather than all different prisoners being put in the same jail context, they were much more, rationally divided according to their criminality, their record, whatever it was. So you already have sorting in the panopticon. And so when somebody says the panopticon is no longer important, we're in post-panoptic times, I say, well, what do we mean by the panopticon? And there are so many different aspects of the panopticon that are important. The enclosed space, the sorting, the invisible observer, all these things are important. And so I say, well, some aspects of the panopticon are no longer present. Other aspects are really important. So, the panopticon would not work if the prisoners were unaware of the possibility of surveillance. You have to be conscious that surveillance is happening in order to modify your behavior such that, in the end, the idea for Foucault is that the prisoners are normalized and habituated to surveillance, and they comply with the organization. So that's one aspect of panopticon. But the sorting is a different aspect. The invisibility of the observer is another, which can be related, for example, to surveillance cameras. Whether or not you can see the camera also makes a difference to the form of surveillance that is possible, to whether or not it's desirable, etc., etc. And with the digitizing of cameras, there has been this shrinking of size. And so, I look at the ceiling, I can't see the cameras in here, but of course I can't see them now because they're so tiny that you can't see them. So it makes a difference whether the observer is visible to the observed. So there are so many aspects of panopticon that I think are worth teasing out and saying, well, yes, this is no longer appropriate, but this may well be appropriate. So the panopticon argument. The panopticon argument, yes, it's sort of, it's Agamben meets Foucault, and they, come together in one concept. And Bigot facilitates this relationship. So Agamben's The Ban meets Foucault's Panopticon. And in this case, the sorting is present because certain groups are going to be excluded. Foucault's point about Bentham's Panopticon is that it is inclusive. That the point of the Panopticon is to encourage behaviors that are common in all those who participate. You become part of a whole in which you comply, and the whole organization is then inscribed in those who are the inmates or the prisoners, the people in the Panopticon. Agamben's point, which is of course related to a whole theoretical and historical discussion beyond what we're talking about now, is that certain groups in the population are singled out for banning. Bigot's point is that surveillance mechanisms facilitate that banning because they're no longer inclusive but intended to exclude certain categories of people. And those categories I've already been discussing. So that's where the ban-opticon idea comes from. Yet again, play of words in English that is to be then translated and understood in a different way. So yeah, the relationship between sovereignty and law, as you phrased it, in relation to Agamben is tremendously important. And Agamben is now saying that that recent argument that I referred to in Athens was interesting, of course, for democracy, that he gave the speech in Athens. But it's theatre, That speech, I think, is really rather important because what he argues there is that not only is democratic practice threatened by contemporary forms of surveillance, but the possibility of politics itself is being undermined by the same things. The idea of the polis, the capacity of the people to interact, the knowledge of the people, the knowledgeability about government on which democracy depends, is undermined by the very ways in which so-called politics is occurring. So Agamben's critique extends beyond the democratic to the polis itself in that speech in Athens. I think it's rather an interesting speech, and it directly invokes surveillance as the mechanism whereby not only democracy but also politics is being undermined. There are other people who have made very good contributions to this debate on the same kinds of lines. And interestingly, some of them come from a more technical and engineering background, and they have seen this from the point of view of software engineering and computer science. I find that very interesting, that they can see exactly the same thing. I can give you some of the names later if you want. But yeah, that argument about the undermining of politics. Oh, another person, Eli Pariser, has a book called The Filter Bubble. The Filter Bubble. And Eli Pariser argues that, and this is the reason I'm mentioning it, is because it speaks to this argument about the undermining of politics itself. Pariser, his name is P-A-R-I-S-E-R, P-A-R-I-S-E-R, Pariser. Eli Pariser in The Filter Bubble says that all the platforms that we use on the internet tend towards reinforcing already existing kinds of mentalité, already existing ways of looking at the world, because what they do, I mean, again, Facebook makes a good illustration. Facebook works by way of friends. Friends are people with whom you are willing to associate. You have accepted them as friends, or you have asked them to be friends, and you have not yet unfriended them. Okay. Well, Facebook made it possible to get rid of a friend by gone. So the concept of friendship has also totally altered since Mark Zuckerberg. And officially, that's not part of what we're talking about this afternoon. So the filter bubble is, okay, so Amazon we used as an example earlier on. How does Amazon work? Well, Amazon works with associations. Okay, so you read this book. It started with books. It's many other things now. You read this book. We also know a few million other people who read this book. They also like this book. We think that you will like this book because they like this book. Okay, it's all done by associations and by very complex algorithms that help Amazon to determine the category that we are in and that we can be associated with so that we can have things suggested to us. And what does that do, says Pariser? It creates a filter bubble whereby we encourage ourselves to read more of the same, see more of the same, listen to more of the same. Because that's obviously what we want within the consumer marketplace. And so it's just a filter bubble. And it reinforces those already existing views that we have. Our Facebook friends do not include all kinds of people who we might not think we have much in common with. Because by and large, we don't hit yes or confirm in order to have so-and-so as our Facebook friend. We think, never heard of that person, or I have heard of that person, and oh my gosh, I don't want to be associated with that person. So, no, you declined that one. And so what it does is it reinforces our filter bubble. Those things that we already believed and thought about the world are reinforced. And of course, classical notions of democratic practice are meant to be inclusive in the sense that, you know, the refugee, the stranger, the alien, the poor person, whatever it is included, and we get to hear their voice within the democratic discourse. But the filter bubble that now runs our world excludes by definition, so that we don't even have access to the difference that is expressed in the other. We never get to encounter the other. And so, you know, I think that whole political question of what sorts of politics are possible in the filter bubble era are really important. The same goes for voter targeting. The Americans claim that Obama won his second term in office through the use of targeted voter surveillance. So you know, once upon a time, some of us believed that you voted for a party whose policies you thought were at least the least bad, if not the best. But with targeted voting surveillance, the same methods are applied. The same kind of filter bubble methods are applied. In this case, you go to those who are revealed by the consumer surveillance corporations as being, as having a particular interest. And you can narrow it down more and more, just like the consumer surveillance people, they're called marketing, try to narrow it down to a very small group. And so you find out the group of people who have very particular interests in this part of the country and whose demographic profile is very specific, and yet where they are unclear about which way they might vote in Canada, whether they would vote for the Tory party, the Conservatives, or the Liberals, or the New Democrats. And you look for these people who are both just might vote for the ruling party, the Conservatives, but who have not shown any clear indication that they will. And you focus on them, and then you don't give them a set of policies. You say, we know what you want. You want lower taxes on agricultural equipment. We can provide that. Our new government will give lower taxes on agricultural equipment. And you've targeted that little group, and they see this message, and they think, oh my gosh, that's what we've been looking for years. You don't think about anything else because you were never presented with any policy. You just have targeted voting. And that's what's happening in so many countries around the world. Exactly the same kind of consumer database marketing surveillance is being applied to the political process. So in practice, that means that policy is irrelevant to the whole equation. It doesn't even come into the equation of political life. So in these ways, I think that, to go back to your question, the kinds of things that Agamben is saying, I think are very appropriate because, you know, on this political basis, I mean, sovereignty, the rule of law, all those kinds of things can happen much more easily if you've demolished the possibility of real politics happening anyway. So, you know, state of exception, temporary, temporary suspension of the rule of law with no actual rationale or timetable, because temporary has been taken out of state of exception. The temporal dimension is lost. And so without saying so, it's a permanent state. And but that connects, you know, the state of exception, suspension of the rule of law happens much more easily if you are working with consumer database type of politics, because it's not politics. This is the filter bubble approach. And so what might appear to be, you know, this is rather good with Amazon, they know exactly what I want to read. And the consequences are much less malign with Amazon, because usually Amazon gets it pretty close to right. But the consequence for political life of using the same methods is dire, in my view. So just like I was saying about the ways in which risk discourses may be ethically and politically appropriate in one context, opposing climate change, they're entirely inappropriate, in my view, ethically, when you apply it to post 9/11 terrorist risks. And let's not forget, the chances of our lives being in any way damaged by terrorism are far smaller than being struck by lightning. It's worth remembering that really the thing that seems to be driving the politics of the world, security, anti-terrorism, is such a minuscule risk. If we increase the use of seatbelts in cars, we would save many more lives than we would by the billions spent on national security. But now we're getting into political matters.
Alex, y luego Marlene, y luego Maribel.
Two quick questions. What do you think is the if organizations and software organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and software like Redphone and TechSecure that are meant to be counter-surveillance software, do you think those kinds of things have a political role to play in mass surveillance society? That's the first question. And the second one is that you mentioned William Connolly's concept of essentially contested concepts. I think it was in the terms of political discourse. Can we think, is surveillance and also counter-surveillance, are those also essentially contested concepts? And if so, what would be the implication?
Yeah, great questions. Whenever people ask about the political responses to the kinds of mass surveillance that we have to talk about today in the post-Snowden time, I argue that there can only be multifaceted, multi-layered responses, because the situation itself is multifaceted and multi-layered. It involves corporate actors, it involves government actors, it involves the technologies themselves, which can so easily reinforce an already existing situation. The technologies, of course, are always socially produced. They're political, they have politics already embedded in them, but nonetheless, once in place, they help to reinforce certain kinds of activities. So, at so many levels, surveillance has developed, and at so many levels, it has to be countered when it is unnecessary, unwarranted, illegal, unjust, all those things I said before. And so, therefore, within that, I'd say yes, of course, there is a place for Electronic Frontier Foundation, for Redphone, for all the other kinds of counter-surveillance softwares, forms of hacking activity, so many other things that are important for resisting surveillance of certain kinds at a technical level and among those who are trying to exercise their responsibilities as technically competent people in this in this context. So yeah, I think they are. They do play an important role within that situation. And I applaud the kinds of things that they do. And even some things that I think are tinged with other sorts of motifs, like, okay, so there's something called privacy by design, or even better, privacy by design and default. So, privacy by design people, this is technically competent people who are trying to build into the very design of the systems that they create ways in which personal privacy or personal data can be protected more carefully. I totally think that this is something that is very important, especially if it's privacy by design and by default. That is to say, the default setting is privacy. It's not something that you opt into, it's something that is there as the baseline. So, you know, I think that movements like that are very good. Sometimes they're tinged with unfortunate, as I see it, commercial competition and a lot of other things that are there. But it's an inevitable part of the, well, not inevitable, nothing's inevitable till it happens, but it's a sort of tendency that I regret some aspects of it, because I think there are bigger and more important things to be concerned about. But I do think that movements like privacy design and the open software movement, which is doing the opposite of trying to control information that so much surveillance is also trying to do. It's a counter movement in that open software is widening things, making greater access to a larger number of people. And I think that those who work in this area ought to see the common goals of open software movement and anti-surveillance movement. And the more those organizations see common political goals, the better it is. So I do think there's a part for them. But at the same time, I think there's an important role for people who are policy making at a high level. There's an important role for people who are trying to change law that has been around for a long time. So privacy and data protection law in just about every country in the world was formed in the 1980s. And the world today is totally different. Well, that's an exaggeration. The world today is significantly different in ways that require new legal formulations in order to constrain certain kinds of activities and enable other kinds of activities for today. And so often the debates, like the debates post-Snowden in the United States, they're legal wrangles over some detail of whether some law was being adhered to or not. But really the question is, why are these millions of people under mass surveillance? Not. Anyway. So legal change, technical change, educational change, working with children and young people to talk about how we live in a digital era. Multi-generational, intergenerational activity in an educational sphere seems to me to be crucial. You know, we talk jokingly about children who grow up thinking that their thumb is their most important digit, thinking that their telephone is an extension of their hand, thinking all these things. We make jokes about it, but really, as the parents and grandparents of these kids, as the teachers of these kids, blah, 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 we should be the ones working with them. My colleague, Valerie Steeves at the University of Ottawa, sets an example here. She's a researcher in this area, but she works with young people, children, and she has a special project on what that she calls e-girls. So it's particularly directed towards young women and their use of the internet and understanding both their vulnerabilities and their capacities to make a difference online. And she works with these kids. So I think at all times we need a multi-generational educational aspect to the political struggle. I also think that any of us who works within an organization, because every organization we work with does surveillance, there is no non-surveillant organization around today, we should also be contributing to the ways in which the surveillance is done. Why do we need to have all those fields in the data records that we keep on our students? Is it necessary to have all those fields? Do we need those data on our students? What are we using those data for? you know, if we as faculty ask some questions in the university about this sort of thing, we've got a struggle at the moment at Queen's because without asking the faculty, the administration switched to using Microsoft 365, which looks great on paper, but this is the very system that is implicated in the Snowden revelations. This is the very thing that allows for a kind of across-the-board connection of data in different contexts. Is that necessary? Do we need it? Do we want? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't even like the fact that somebody in the university administration can decide that they want to have a meeting with me and put it in my calendar. I never agreed to this thing. So, you know, I think there's the way in which we are implicated as university people. We work within a highly surveillant organization. I have several colleagues who've done great work on the university as surveillance organization. And the ways in which administrations try to connect data from different parts of the university. You know, why should the people in the health center know what the people in the student residences are eating for breakfast? You can understand why people in the health center would like to know what they're eating for breakfast, but why should it be any of their business? Really? But if you connect those data together, it becomes perfectly possible to see what people are eating for breakfast in there. And you might think it sounds innocent, but like all these data, it turns out to be tremendously revealing what people eat for breakfast. So, you know, here's the university itself. So, in answer to your question, yes, I think EFF, yes, I think that those, you know, privacy-enhancing technologies, all that sort of thing is a crucially important area. But I only say it in relation to legal change, other forms of technical change, educational change, our own responsibility within organizations, every level. The surveillance affects all of us at every level. If we're going to resist those aspects of it that are inappropriate and unwarranted, then it has to be also countered at every level and in every available way. So, yeah.
Marlene, yes. This morning you said that there is a connection between the studies in surveillance and the studies in theology. Would you please elaborate more in which ways are you doing these connections?
Theology.
Theology, yeah.
Okay. So I expected the historical question from you, but okay, we'll have the theological question. See, you can't predict anything. Facebook thinks you can predict, but you can't. Thank you for coming. I understand the. I know this is. It sounds a bit idiosyncratic for me to bring theology in, but. You know, I find myself a willing participant in the Christian tradition, and therefore theology is interest to me. And I have this colleague at the University of St. Andrews in Edinburgh, and he has a little unit on theology of surveillance. And I looked at his site the other day, and there's a Swedish theologian who was coming to speak at Edinburgh, and her paper sounded really interesting. I wish I'd been there. It was about surveillance, selfies, and the obsession with, it's called Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. Surveillance, selfies, and the obsession with something. Anyway, it looked like a really interesting paper. She's a theologian from, I think, Uppsala University in Sweden. It affects my own work in many ways and at many levels. And as I say, I'm a conscious and willing participant in the Christian tradition. I identify that way, so That's my starting point, and it affects the ways that I think about the ethics of surveillance. Let me remind you or tell you about a story, and that will answer the question, I hope. Okay, so here's the story. You've come across Abraham and Sarah. Okay, so Abraham and Sarah is the story that we're going to think about. You ready? Okay, Abraham and Sarah could not have children, and they were very disturbed by this, both of them, because in that culture it was very important to have children to retain the family name and the family tradition. And at that time there was the possibility of having a surrogate mother for the child of the male, because it's a patriarchal line. And this was enshrined in law, and it was possible to have a surrogate mother. And so Abraham suggested to Sarah that she should take her servant, Hagar, to be the surrogate mother. So this is what happened. And Hagar gets pregnant, and Sarah gets jealous, and there's a lot of resentment, and you can imagine the situation. Hagar can't stand it any longer, runs off to the desert, and in the desert is just completely alone, and she thinks she's going to die. Suddenly she's confronted with this person in the desert. And the person in the desert says, "What are you doing here?" She says, "Well, I just ran away from my mistress, and I think I'm going to die here because I can't go on with the life that I was leading there. It was so terrible." And oh, and I should say that Hagar was Egyptian. So she was not Hebrew, as Sarah and Abraham. And so the messenger says, "Well, yeah, actually the situation is this. God has seen you, and you should be aware of that. And actually, you're going to have to return to the situation from which you came, but it'll work out, and your son, you're going to have a son, your son will be the father of many people, and they will be independent survivors in a difficult world." Okay, so the point of the story. At that moment, Hagar did something that is never done anywhere else in the biblical scriptures. She named God. Nowhere else in the Christian Bible does a woman name God. And she names God El Rohi, which means the God who sees me. And the word she used for sees is noticed me. He was or she was aware of my condition. And that form of seeing I take to be one of the bases for a critical ethics of surveillance. Because that seeing of a foreign Egyptian, female, subordinate, fugitive, runaway, 3 categories of vulnerability. Those were the categories of vulnerability that God saw. And because of seeing this woman in those categories of vulnerability, God was going to act in a way that would produce flourishing, justice, and a situation of the overturning of the disadvantages that she experienced in that moment. And I think myself that that story is there to speak to exactly that situation. You hear what I said about social sorting and the vulnerabilities of the sorting of categories. Those were extreme categories of vulnerability that Hagar was experiencing, foreign female fugitive. They're also categories that actually the Torah, the Jewish law, is supposed to protect those forms of vulnerability. And so what was there in that sudden naming of God is also available in the actual legal situation that should be accorded to foreign female fugitives. So in so many ways, I find a critical ethic of surveillance available even in the text of the biblical scriptures. Now, I know, I wrote a little article about this, I've written about the ways in which surveillance as the eye of God has been used in very negative and repressive ways through medieval thought, medieval paintings, the eye of God, Kawe, Deus Videt, in the painting of the Seven Deadly Sins by Hieronymus Bosch, that was used throughout the medieval period as a form of social control. So I'm not denying that religion as a sort of authorized institutional base may not use surveillance in or images of surveillance in very repressive and negative ways. I'm not saying anything about that, but I'm saying that in the actual text of the biblical scriptures, there are emancipatory, empowering, liberating, and justice-orienting dimensions that I think speak exactly to contemporary situations that we experience and that I write about in the context of surveillance studies. So I'm prepared to mine those resources which come from the tradition that I identify with to show that there is an ethic available right there in those resources that actually speaks against the negative and repressive use of surveillance by some institutional religious bodies, and which breaks out with a sort of, I was going to say a theology of liberation that would associate with other things, but certainly here there is an optics of hope over against the optics of fear that dominates contemporary mass surveillance. I think it's a very, very different optics. And so it's another reason why, I try to argue with Zygmunt Bauman. You try arguing with Zygmunt Bauman. I tell you, it's not straightforward. I try to argue with him that there are occasions for hope. There are moments for hope. There are ways in which we can see in things like this moments for hope. But I didn't succeed with him. I do better with you. I don't know. So I tell you a story in answer. Does that make sense? That's one answer. There are other places.
I understand.
And we could tell other stories too. We could tell stories about Jesus under surveillance. If you read the Gospels about Jesus under surveillance from the very first day that he started to speak publicly, if you read that story surveillantly through the Gospels and how Jesus himself is under constant, malign, negative, destructive surveillance from day one till when they killed him for what he was saying and did. There's another story there that we could tell. I'm not here to...
It is said in the Bible, I was sleeping when my heart was washing. Yo dormía, pero mi corazón velaba.
Yeah.
Eso.